Hi there and welcome to class 7 of Python scripting in Cinema 4D. This week we will begin our classes on plugins. Plugins are a great way to extend the capabilities of Cinema beyond what you already did with scripts and tags and effectors. You can create your own objects, you can create new tags, you can create your own commands like these here, new shaders even. So there are almost limitless possibilities, and you can even use it to connect Cinema to other applications. What we're going to do in the next couple of classes is to have a look at the different types of plugins there, how to set them up, how to develop them obviously, and we are going to create one or two plugins of our own based on what we already learned in the previous classes, but instead of using scripts or tags, now we are basically re-implementing what we already did as a plugin. Plugins are of course great not just because they can extend Cinema over what it already can do, but it's also great to distribute your scripts to other people. And one way that Maxon helps you with that is that it lets you encrypt your Python scripts. Because normally Python, being a scripted language, comes always with its source code, which may or may not be what you want to do when you sell your plugins. So Cinema comes with a function to encrypt your code, and thus you can sell Python plugins just as well as your compiled C++ plugins without your user being able to look into your source code and copy it. But before we even look at the documentation, I wanted to show you a specific function within Cinema that you will use all the time when you develop Python plugins, and that's this one here, or rather in the plugins menu, it's called Reload Python Plugins. Now this is new in, I think it was this version or version 12, I think it was this one. And basically what it does is exactly what's on the label. It reloads all the plugins from disk. Where previously when you developed a plugin and you made a change to the source code, you had to stop Cinema and start it again every single time you wanted to make the change live, which was getting really annoying if you made small changes all the time. So this is a real big helper. So you just press here and it's reloading the plugin. Actually, you can see here it already loaded my sample plugin here. And for convenience, I always just drag it here on the toolbar, so I can just click here and reload my plugin whenever I need it. Right, so after you've set this up, let's have a quick look at the documentation. And the first point where you should look obviously should be, let's go back to the top, should be in the c4d plugins module. Now in here you can already see what I mentioned at the beginning, the different types of plugins that you can create. First off, there's the command data plugin, which is, well, a command data plugin you have to think of as a new command for Cinema. And usually you build a user interface around it, and then you can issue commands that are, well, methods within your Python script that you can then call by, for example, pushing a button. Another big one is the tag data plugin, which is adding new tags to your Cinema. The object data is adding new object types, like you remember the base objects. Based on the base object, you can create your own ones, like in class, I think 1 it was, where we made our weirdly shaped spheres and modified the polygons. That you could do within a plugin, and then by using the object data plugin, create that, well, as a plugin. You can create your own shaders and so on. All these plugins are based on a common principle. What you do is you register the type of plugin that you want to create within your source code. You call this register command, which tells Cinema what kind of plugin, well, this plugin is supposed to be. And when you're calling this register command, you're passing in a new object based on the type of plugin that you want to create. And that object you're then filling out. And the best way is to look at an example like the command data one. If we look at the command data, you see a number of methods. Now, when you create a new plugin based on command data, you will get these functions which will initially do nothing at all. What you are going to do is you're going to override them, which it tells you here. So this command that you create already has a method called execute. And whenever Cinema calls to execute plugins, it will call this method automatically. But by default, it does nothing. So when you create a new plugin, you are filling out, or you're putting your methods within these pre-existing methods. And that's how plugins work. Cinema always calls specific functions in specific situations that are predefined within your plugins, and you decide what happens within them. It will become much clearer once we look at the source code and you see how it works. But that's the general principle. You're registering a new object of a specific plugin type, and that object you fill out with your custom functions. When you've done that, your plugins are housed in two different folders. And they are these two here. Well, we are already in one. Right. So there's one within the Cinema folder itself. And this is the same on Windows and on macOS. So there's one in Cinema itself, which is the global plugins folder, which is available to all users. And then there's a user-specific one, which is on Windows it's in the app data, and on macOS it's in the library application support folder. And that's the user-specific folder, and every user can have their own plugins in there. Which is of course useful if you have multiple people working on your workstation and you want different setups. But generally, if you're working on a machine yourself, it really doesn't matter in which folder you put your plugins. Cinema will find them in both. In our case, we're going to work in the app data, but like I said, it really doesn't matter. Now here I already have a plugin, and that's the one we are going to look at today. And let's have a quick look into that folder. So we have the plugin source code here, which is a Python file with the extension pyp. Now regular Python files have the extension py. And Cinema uses pyp, which is just Python plugin. But there's nothing specific about the file type otherwise. It's really just the extension pyp in a normal text file. And within is the source code for that plugin. And then every plugin has a resource folder, which is just short res. And in there, well, in this case, that's just the icon. And all the other resources you would have, like graphics or anything else, you would put into the resource folder. In other types of plugins, you have so-called descriptions files in there as well. There are different ways that you have to build these folders up for different plugins. Some, like this one, where we create our user interface from the source code itself, they don't require anything further. They just have the source code and the resource folder, nothing in it, or just some icons. Others have all their UI data as description files within the resource folders. Again, we're going to look at both of them. This week we're going to concentrate on the simplest possible version, which is this one here, where everything is happening in the source code, and the resource folder really only contains our icon. Now, what we are going to do this week is we are going to create this plugin here. And this is based on what we did last week, where we copied animation data from one object to another. So this is our plugin, and you can see we have created a simple user interface here with a couple of fields, which are numeric fields, a couple more of those, and link fields where we can drag and drop items into. Let's see here, and a button. So it's quite straightforward, nothing special. And what it's going to do is it's going to copy animation from one to another object. This is one of those command data plugins. So let's have a look how we create that. First, let's go one step back. We know we have to register it. So let's see here, we have the register command plugin. Let's click on it and see what it expects us here. So it says it's going to register a new command data plugin, which is what we want to do. And you're seeing here it's expecting an ID, a name, and some further information in there. Now the first thing first, the ID. This is a unique plugin ID that Maxon or Cinema expects for every single one of your plugins. So this has to be unique, because that's how Cinema is going to address your plugins. It's like a namespace. So whenever you create a new plugin and it leaves your development stage and you want to give it out to other people, you have to make sure that you create a unique plugin ID specifically for your plugin. And that's very easy by going to the plugin cafe, and in there's this point here, plugin IDs, and there you can create your own plugins by just giving it a working title. It doesn't have to be the final title of your plugin. Just click on Get Plugin ID and you get your IDs. And you can see here I have already created a number of them for some tests and also some final plugins. And these are no secret numbers. They are relatively public. It's just to be sure that every single one has its own. And what you can also see here on top is that these numbers here, from 1 to 10, they are reserved for development, so you can safely use those while you're developing. But once you're done with developing and giving it out to people, make sure you get a plugin ID. So you already have your ID now, and then you're giving it a name, and that's just a string. Then there are a couple of flags you can set for your plugin, and those are important if you, for example, if you want to create a new hotkey command. But we don't want to do that, so we are staying with the basic setting, which is no flag at all. Then there's the icon, and in those in here it expects a bitmap file, and how to create that I'll show you again in a second. And then there's the tooltip and the instance that we want to create, and that's the command object that we're creating. And to make things easier, you can see here there's already a ready-made example for you, so you can just stick to that. Let's see what we did in this source code. So that's the source code of the plugin you just saw, and you see here it's located in, well, you can't see it actually. Let me just show you. It's located within that application data folder I showed you a second ago. And let's see, all the way at the bottom, there's our main section. So all this stuff on top, I'm just going to fold that up. Those are the class definitions on top here, but the main thing, the one that's being called first, and that's indented all the way to the left here, that's this function at the bottom. And, well, it's not really a function, it's kind of like the main function. And these commands end with the register command plugin, but we start by creating a bitmap. And you remember, for its icon, Cinema expects a bitmap file, and that's being done by using the bitmap function, which is this one here, and that's creating a blank file. And then we're getting the path to the icon, and you may remember, I think I used that in a previous class already, or I've mentioned it in the forums. The _file_ is a system variable, a system variable that points to the location of this source code here on the disk, and we're getting that, and we're splitting it up into the directory and the name of the script itself. And with the directory name, we then add the res part and the icon.tif to it. So we end up with with this directory path to this icon here. And having that file name, or that path to that file name, now in this parameter, we just pass it again to the bitmap object. We're initializing that bitmap object with that path, and now we have our icon file. And that one we use then within our register command plugin. Now you see here I'm using the plugin ID that I define as a global variable on top, and I'm using one of the development IDs here, but you remember you have to create your own ones later on. Just giving it a name, no flag, there's the icon, there's the name again, and here's the object that we want to create. And Mike, I named it all the same, but you could of course use different names. But what happens is, when this is being called, it's finalizing its call by creating a new object of this type, or by calling this class here. And that's this one here. And you see, when we create a class, we can inherit from a base class, and in our case, we are inheriting from c4d plugins command data, and that's the one here, c4d plugins command data, the one we already looked at before. So what we create now is a new class based on this as a template, and the moment that we create our class, this one here, using this as its parent, we create a new class that already has a function called execute, restore layout, message, and so on, but they don't do anything, or they do something, usually some basic functionality, but they won't affect any of your your scene or anything. It's just a template. So now that we have created our class based on that template, we have to fill that out, and let's look into it. And what we have here is, first of all, a blank dialog variable, which does nothing. Then we have the init method, which is always being called the first time that an object of this type is being created. Again, does nothing. We have the message function, which also does nothing, but the message function is usually in there to receive messages from Cinema, and those messages are constantly being created for all kinds of events. Like when the screen is being redrawn, or when some user interaction happens, Cinema is sending out a message to the plugins or to any elements within Cinema, and you can catch those messages and react to them. So every message has its own ID, and you can then base your reaction on that ID or just ignore it. In our case, we're just ignoring everything right now. And then we have the execute function, and that's being executed when we start the plugin. And what we do here is we check whether our dialog, which is this one here, is none, which it is in the beginning. If it is, we are creating a dialog. If not, we do nothing. And in either case, if we created it or if we didn't create it, we will return that dialog and open it with some default parameters here, and that's all for our plugin, really, for the command data plugin. And you can already see here that's not doing much. That's not doing any of the functionality that we want, like copying data over from one object to another. So while this is actually the plugin object that we create, it's not doing the work. The work is actually being done within the dialog later on. So and here, this is where object-oriented programming comes into play. And some people in the forums were a bit confused about how this works, and I really encourage you to read up on how the class system and all that, basically object-oriented programming, how it works. It's really important to understand the basics there. Generally what we do is here, we create another object from this object and then do the work in that one. So while at its core this is a command data object, what really happens is that this is just being used as a launcher for a dialog, which is based on the c4d GUI module and its GE dialog class. And we're going to look at that in a second, but just so you understand what is happening here. So when we register the plugin, Cinema calls this function, and this function creates a new object of this class here. And this class, or this object, then creates a new object of this class here. And this class, being based on the dialog or GE dialog class, has a function called open, which will open the dialog. And while the dialog stays open, we are staying within this method here, and we are not returning. So while this is open, and while stuff is happening in here, this is basically being put on hold. And only when this is being closed again, then this function here finishes and we return from the plugin. So basically our command data plugin is just a launcher for the dialog. And let's see what happens in the dialog. And we see already a lot more is happening in here. So all our actually intelligence is happening within the dialog. Let's step through it again from top to bottom. Now, first we see it's inheriting from GE dialog. Let's look at the documentation here, and I already have that open. And that's actually in the C++ help. So let's see. Oh no, I did have it open here. There. So the GE dialog, that's in the GUI module, and then GE dialog, and basically all the dialogs you see in Cinema are based on this class. And similar to the plugin, you can see here there are methods to override. So just like before, these messages exist, or these methods exist as a template within our newly created dialog, but they don't do anything yet. So we can fill them with our own commands. And then of course you have these functions here that do something, and you can't override them, but you will of course use them to open or close your dialog, to send messages to other objects, and so on. And then you have a lot more functions that are having to do with creating your own interface. And then even more functions to get and set values to, or to assign values to your interface and to get those values back. And some miscellaneous stuff. So you see there are lots of functions in this class, and we're not going to look at all of them. Let's try to keep it as simple as possible. And let's look again at what we did here. So first things first, we use the create layout function, and that's based on this function here. Again, one we can override. And well, there's not much of a description here, but I can tell you what it does. It is what helps you, or what is actually creating this here, the user interface. So within the create layout, we assign these UI elements to the layout, and we can also pass initial parameters to them. So first step, we are setting the title of the object itself. So this dialog can have a title, which is simply this one here. That's the title. And then we start creating the UI. So the entire UI you see here, that's this part beginning here until here, or maybe if you want to include the default parameters, until here. So this part here, oops, that's what's creating the UI. And that's the one way to create the UI that I mentioned. The other was to use description files, which we will look at in a different class. In this one here, we are creating our UI from code. So all of these functions, they're all functions of GE dialog. Let's begin with a simple section first, the simplest of them all. So that's, I'd say, this one here. So you can see in that we have some edit number errors, blah blah, and start and end. So if you look at here, that's this part here. So we have start, a number, and a number. So this line here, we're going to look at that now. So we begin by defining a group, and a group has a beginning and an end. Now group end, you can already see that's a simple command. It just closes the group again. And group begin, it begins, well, with a number and some flags and more numbers. So let's look at the definition and dialog. And let's see, where is it? There we have group begin. So group is really just an encapsulation of UI elements. So a group itself doesn't show up in your UI, but it lets you, well, group elements into a group, and it also lets you define columns. And that's quite handy when you want to have elements like these here next to each other, because by default all elements will just be stacked on one on another. And in most cases you want, of course, have some sort of control over the layout. And you can do that by grouping and using columns. So the first thing to create a group is to pass an ID. Now IDs are being used all the time and throughout the entire GE_dialog function class. And through these IDs you can access UI elements and set and get their values if they have values. But even groups or just simple text labels, they all have IDs. These IDs are just numeric values, and they have or should be unique for every item. Now, with the groups, it isn't that important that they are unique, but every other element should have its own ID. Then you have flags, and these layout flags, they are there for, to decide how the element is being positioned on screen. And you can see here you have BFH and BFV flags, and they stand for horizontal and vertical. And then you have different ways of positioning and scaling them. So you have, like in a text editor, you have left, right, centered, or scaled, so it stretches out over the entire screen. And then the more interesting part is the columns, and that's what we are using here as well. And you can give it a title and some further advanced flags that we are not going to look at right now. But they can be quite interesting, like making sure that all your columns have the same width, for example. So let's see what we did here. We created our group. We made sure that it's scaled and fit to the horizontally and vertically. We gave it 4 columns, and we are not changing the rows, and we're not giving it a name. So the important bit being the 4 columns here. So that means that the next 4 elements that are coming after the group definition are all being put one next to each other, and the one following this would be put into the next row with the next 4 stacks next to each other. So if there were 7 elements following up, you would have one row with 4 and one row with 3 elements. And our first element is a static text, which is more or less a text label. And we just gave that the ID 0 because we are not going to access a static text. We're making it left bound, and we're not giving it a default size. So let's look at the static text command here. I always have to scroll up again because there's so much in here. So in here, add static text. There we go. So we have the ID and the flags, same as always. Then you can give it an initial width and height. And if you just leave them at 0, it's going to just scale to the corresponding size of the text you put in there. And then you have, well, it says the name of the button, but it's not a button. It's just a label. And these kind of things here, I mean, you will encounter this all the time in the documentation. This is just being copied and pasted from here to here, really. And that's why it says button here, but we're not dealing with a button. So sometimes you have to think for yourself, really, and to make sense of the documentation here. Or if you're unsure what's it's being telling you here, the way to double check is to go into the C++ documentation and have a look. So let's look for that here. And yeah, you see there's no mentioning of a button here. So yeah, double check in here. The C++ documentation, that one is usually correct. The Python documentation is correct in 90% of the cases, but sometimes it's just giving you some weird information, and yeah, you just have to live with it, I guess. You can give it a border style. In our case, we're just leaving it empty because I don't want it to be bordered, but you can see here you can have these nice drop shadow borders and all this. So that I leave that to your personal taste, I guess. Alright, so that's creating a label. And then we create an edit number arrows. Again, let's quickly look at the documentation. And there. And that's this one here. So that's a numeric field with these up and down arrows, which will change the value. And that's very straightforward. It's just the IDs and the layout flags and some width and height. And you may already notice that it's missing any way to define what kind of number is in here, any limits to that number. And you're right, that's not being defined here. This is just purely layout. There's a second command that you use to change certain default values to this field, and unfortunately it's not telling you in the documentation which one that is. It is, however, telling you in the C++ documentation, but I can tell you that what you are using to set these values is the setReal command. And the setReal command is, as you can see here, having a lot of parameters that will let you set min and max values. But I'll show you that within the source code because it makes more sense. Unfortunately, we've been running out of time a bit now, and we'll continue from exactly this point in the next week when we will look further into how to create the GUI from the source code. Hope to see you then. Bye.